Welcome to the North Sessions. Settle in and let every story carry you towards sleep. I'm Lewis, and tonight I'll be reading for you. This evening, we find ourselves in the quiet warmth of 221B Baker Street, where Sherlock Holmes sits alone between cases on a grey November afternoon, watching the fire and listening to the rain. Before we begin, take a moment to find a comfortable position and let the sound of the fire and the soft rain outside settle gently around you. And when you're ready, we'll step inside together. Notice now the weight of your body where it rests. Feel how the surface beneath you holds you, steady and easy, asking nothing of you at all. Let your shoulders drop just a little without any effort, as though they've been waiting for permission. Your hands can be still. Your jaw can soften. There is nowhere you need to be and nothing you need to carry into this hour. Let your breath move at its own pace, in and out, quiet and untroubled. With each slow breath, your chest settles a little further. Your legs feel heavier, your feet warm and at rest. The sound of the fire is close and gentle. The rain is thin and far away. You are held here, in the dark behind your eyes, safe and unhurried. The story is beginning now, soft and steady, and all you have to do is listen. The violin had rested long enough across his knees that he barely felt its weight anymore. Holmes became aware of it again only when he shifted slightly in his chair, the leather giving a soft, familiar sound beneath him. He looked down at the instrument for a moment, considering it the way one might consider a question that no longer seemed urgent. Then, with the care of long habit, he leaned forward and set it gently against the side of the armchair, resting the scroll against the worn fabric there. He sat still for a breath or two after that, his hands empty in his lap. The fire had settled into a lower, steadier burn while he had been sitting. The coals glowed a deep amber now, banked and easy, sending heat out in long, quiet waves that reached as far as the hearthrug and no farther. A thin thread of smoke lifted from a half-collapsed log and dissolved before it reached the mantelpiece. The smell of it was pleasant, dry and faintly woody, the way an old library smells when the radiators first come on in autumn. Holmes reached toward the side table without looking. His fingers found the pipe by feel, the briar bowl worn smooth in exactly the places his thumb and forefinger always met it. He turned it once in his hand, almost without thinking, and brought it to rest against his palm while he reached next for the tobacco pouch. The pouch was a dark, supple thing, the leather gone soft from years of daily use. He drew it open and pressed 2 fingers inside. working a small measure of tobacco out with the patience of a man who has performed this same small act perhaps 10,000 times. He tamped it into the bowl gently, pressing it down in layers, taking his time with each pass, the tobacco settling in with a quiet, compressed density. From somewhere below, he heard the front door open and close. Not a knock, just the brief intrusion of rain sound, and then its absence again. Mrs. Hudson, returning from some errand on the street, her footsteps easy on the stairs, and then gone into her own rooms below. The building settled back into its quiet around the small sound of her movement, and then there was only the fire and the rain again. Holmes touched a long match to the grate and held it over the bowl, drawing in 2 or 3 steady pulls until the tobacco caught. A small curl of pale smoke rose from the pipe and thinned into the warm air above the chair. He leaned back slowly, resting his head against the cushion, the pipe stem between his teeth, and let his gaze return to the window, where the rain continued its gentle, unbroken work against the glass. The pipe burned down quietly, without him quite noticing when it passed from lit to merely warm. He became aware of it gradually, the way one becomes aware that a sound has stopped, a small absence where something had been. The drawer had gone thin, and the bowl, when he cupped it lightly in his palm, held only the faint heat of spent tobacco. He did not move straight away. For a little while he simply sat with the cooling pipe resting against his lower lip, watching a rivulet of rain trace its way down the outside of the window glass. It found a crooked path that branched and rejoined and disappeared at the frame, moving with the easy logic of water, going where the surface let it, indifferent to anything like intention. Then, without particular urgency, he drew the pipe from his mouth and turned it over in his fingers. He tapped it gently against the small brass dish on the side table twice, and the spent ash came loose in a soft, compact little plug and settled there, faintly grey against the brass. A last thin wisp rose from the ash and was gone. The smell that followed was the particular smell of finished tobacco, darker than the smoke itself, a little earthier, faintly sweet in the way cold tea is sometimes faintly sweet. He set the pipe across his knee and reached again for the pouch. The leather was still warm from resting near the fire's edge, and the tobacco inside had dried just slightly since the last fill, which gave it a finer feel between his fingers. He worked a measure out with the same steady attention as before, pressing it into the bowl in careful stages, each small press a considered thing. The whole business taking rather longer than it needed to, because there was no reason at all to hurry. Outside, A cart horse made a single low sound from somewhere along Baker Street, muffled almost entirely by the rain. It was the sort of sound that underscored the quiet rather than breaking it, like a word spoken in a library that only makes the silence feel larger afterward. From the landing came a brief, careful knock at his sitting room door, not the door at street level, but the inner door at the top of the stairs. Mrs. Hudson's knock had a particular quality to it, more announcement than inquiry, and after a moment her voice followed. She had left a small plate of something on the hall table, she said, in case he wanted it. She did not wait for an answer. Her footsteps retreated back down, steady and unhurried, and the building settled again around their diminishing sound. Holmes glanced once toward the door and then back to the window, finishing the last press of tobacco into the bowl with one slow, deliberate thumb. He reached for a match. The matches were kept in a plain ceramic holder on the mantelpiece. He took one out between two fingers and drew it along the rough strip with a single steady pull. The flame came up at once, bright and brief in the way of small fires, wavering once in some imperceptible current of the room, and then settling into its own shape. It was a compact little thing, rounded at the tip and narrowing down to blue at the base, throwing a brief, warm circle of light across his hand and the bowl of the pipe. He held it there, tipping the bowl down into the flame and drawing with a measured patience 4 or 5 long pulls, each one coaxing the tobacco into its first reluctant heat. A thin curl of smoke rose from the bowl before he had properly started, which told him the tobacco had caught at the surface. He drew again, slower this time, and felt the resistance change beneath the pull, that small, familiar shift when a pipe begins to draw freely. The match had burned to within a short distance of his fingers by then. He watched the flame diminish to a very small bright point, and then breathed it out with a quiet breath, the way one might extinguish a candle without thinking. A fine thread of smoke rose from the blackened tip and wandered upward toward nothing. He set the spent match in the brass dish beside the ash. The first smoke from a freshly lit pipe was always a different thing from what came after. It had a rawness to it, a greenish quality, not unpleasant, but not quite settled either. The way the first note a musician draws from an instrument sounds before the wood has warmed and found its voice. He turned the thought over gently, without pressing it anywhere in particular. The fire shifted behind the grate with a low, brief sound, a long resettling, or a pocket of trapped air releasing quietly, and the light in the room moved for just a moment before it steadied again. The rain kept on at the window. It had not varied once in all the time he had been sitting there, which gave it a quality almost like silence. A sound so constant it had stopped registering as sound at all, and had become instead a kind of texture to the afternoon. He drew again from the pipe. The tobacco had found its warmth by now, and the smoke came through full and even, rising from the bowl in a slow, widening column before it lost itself in the still air above his chair. He watched it go without particular thought, the way a person watches water from a bridge, present, easy, not needing it to mean anything. The afternoon held its grey and patient shape around him. He drew from the pipe one final time, easy and without any particular intention behind it, and held the smoke for a moment before letting it go in a long, thin stream toward the ceiling. The tobacco had burned down to its last warmth. He could tell by the weight of the bowl, lighter now than it had been, and by the way the smoke came through thinner, carrying a faint dryness at the back of the throat that signaled the end of things. He turned the pipe stem from his mouth and looked into the bowl. A small grey ash, compact and pale, sitting quietly in the curve of the briar. The tobacco had burned cleanly, which was a thing worth noting. A well-packed pipe burned cleanly. He had learned this early and had not forgotten it. He brought the bowl down toward the brass dish on the side table and tapped it once against the rim. The ash came loose in a small soft fall, barely a sound to it, a whisper of weight, like the first dry leaf of autumn releasing from a branch before the wind has even arrived to ask it. It settled into the dish without any fuss at all. He tapped once more, just to be certain, and a last fine powder sifted down to join the rest. The brass dish was warm where his fingers brushed it, having sat near the fire long enough to carry a gentle heat of its own. Not uncomfortable, but present. A companionable warmth, easy and undemanding. With the bowl upward, he rested the pipe across his knee again, letting what little heat remained in the briar find its own way out into the cool air of the room. From the street below came a sound, brief and soft, the particular hollow knock of a walking stick against wet cobblestone. Unhurried, passing beneath the window and fading steadily toward the far end of Baker Street. He listened to it diminish without moving. Someone making their steady way through the grey afternoon, not pausing, not arriving, simply passing through as the afternoon itself was passing through. The fire gave a quiet sound behind the grate, a small collapse of coal settling into itself, and the light shifted once across the hearthrug before it found its footing again. The ash in the brass dish had gone still. The room had gone still around it. Only the rain kept on, as patient, and even as it had been for hours, filling in the silence between one moment and the next with its steady, unvarying voice. He let his hand rest on the pipe bowl. The briar was cooling now, carrying just the last faint ghost of warmth against his palm. He did not reach for the tobacco pouch, not yet. He did not move toward the mantelpiece right away. He sat with the cooled pipe resting across his palm, feeling the last of the warmth leave the briar. It was barely there now, a memory of warmth more than warmth itself. Then, without any particular hurry, he shifted his weight forward in the chair. The leather gave a small sound beneath him, a low, easy creak, the kind a house makes when it is comfortable and at rest. He rose in a single, easy movement and crossed the few steps to the mantelpiece. The hearthrug was soft underfoot, where the firelight had been warming it all afternoon. He noticed this without thinking about it, the way a person notices things that have simply always been so. The wool fibers giving gently beneath his feet. He set the pipe on the mantelpiece shelf with care, without any sound at all, resting it against the dark edge of the mantel clock. The briar settled into place, still and quiet, as though it had always rested there and was only now returning. The clock ticked beside it. A small brass indoor sound, even and untroubled, measuring out the grey afternoon in portions of no urgency whatsoever. He stood for a moment, his hand still near the pipe, not holding it. Just close. The fire was at his left side now, and he could feel its warmth reaching him from below, gentle and steady against his leg. The coal had settled into a low, even glow. It was the kind of fire that had found its rhythm and intended to keep it. From somewhere below, a door opened and closed. Mrs. Hudson, moving between rooms with her quiet, deliberate step, not coming upstairs. Simply present in the house, as she so often was, an unspoken companionship at the far end of all that stillness. Her footsteps crossed the hall below and faded toward the back of the building. He heard the soft, distant sound of a kettle being moved, nothing more. He looked at the pipe where it lay against the clock. The briar had gone the same cool temperature as the room now. There was no difference left between it and the air. Like a stone carried a long way in the hand, grown familiar, and then set down at last. He turned from the mantelpiece and moved back toward the chair. The hearthrug was still warm beneath his feet as he crossed it. The violin rested where he had left it against the armchair. The rain came on, as it had been coming on, filling the window and the street beyond with its thin, even voice. He settled back into the chair. The room held everything exactly as it was. He sat with the violin across his knees, and for a while he simply left it there. The rain moved against the glass. The fire settled. The clock measured out its small, steady portions. Then his hand moved, without any decision he was aware of, down to the neck of the violin. His fingers closed around it. The wood was cool and smooth under his palm, the grain of it barely perceptible, like the surface of still water caught for a moment in the hand. He lifted the instrument and held it upright, resting the lower bout against his knee. He looked at it without examining it. The varnish caught the firelight in a long amber line along the shoulder, rising and falling with the light as a coal shifted quietly in the grate. The bow was resting across the arm of the chair beside him. He reached for it with his other hand and brought it slowly onto his lap. The rosin block was on the side table. He found it by touch rather than sight, his fingers closing around its familiar weight without hurrying toward it. He drew the bow hair across the block in a single, easy pass. The sound was dry and fine, a soft, papery resistance, steady and without effort, like a hand drawn slowly across rough silk. He drew it again, and again. The same quiet friction each time, the same pale dust rising from the block in a thin, drifting cloud. It caught in the firelight for a moment and was gone. He was not thinking about music. He was not thinking about anything in particular. There was only the bow moving across the rosin, even and without hurry, and the warmth coming off the coals to his left, and the rain making its unhurried way down the glass. From the street below, he heard a cart moving through the wet. The horse's hooves on the stone came up slow and muffled, each one absorbed by the rain before it could form itself into a proper sound. The cart passed. The street returned to its quiet. He drew the bow one last time across the block and let his hand rest. The rosin sat on the side table where it had always sat. The bow lay across his knee. He turned it once in his fingers, feeling the slight drag of the fresh rosin against his thumb where he held the stick, a dull and gentle texture like the edge of old chalk. The violin rested against his other hand. He was in no hurry to begin. There was nothing that required beginning. The afternoon was long, and the fire was steady, and the room was entirely at rest around him. He held the bow and the violin and did not yet bring them together. The rain continued at the window. The clock continued at the mantel. He set the bow down first, across the arm of the chair where it had rested before. Then, with the same quiet care, he lowered the violin back onto his knee and held it there a moment. There was no particular reason to stop. There was no particular reason to continue. The afternoon made no demands either way. He set the violin down on the settee beside him, resting it gently on its side, the scroll pointing toward the window. The varnish caught the grey light from the glass, a dull, soft gleam, easy and without warmth, like the surface of a river seen from a distance. He reached for his pipe. It was on the mantelpiece, where it had been since he set it down. His fingers found the stem without looking. The briar was cool from sitting away from the fire, the bowl smooth at its rim and rough at the sides where his thumb had worn a path across it over years. He turned it once in his hand. The tobacco pouch was in the pocket of his dressing gown. He drew it out and opened it with his thumb, and the smell came up at once, dark and faintly sweet, earthy like turned soil after rain, but softer. It settled into the room without effort. He pinched a small amount from the pouch and pressed it into the bowl. Then a little more, working it down gently with his thumb, packing it even and steady, taking its time. The pouch went back into his pocket. He reached for the matches on the side table. The box was nearly empty. He could hear only 2 or 3 shifting inside it when he picked it up. He struck one. The flame came up small and precise. He held it to the bowl and drew once, letting the tobacco catch. A thin thread of smoke rose from the pipe, then thickened for a moment, then thinned again as the flame died. He shook the match out and set it on the edge of the brass dish. He drew again. The tobacco had taken. The smoke moved up through the still air of the room, rising in a pale and wandering line before the warmth near the ceiling spread it to nothing. Outside, on the pavement below, he heard Mrs. Hudson's step. She moved at her own steady pace, heading out on some errand of her own, her footsteps fading into the rain and gone. He did not move to look. The pipe was warm in his hand. The room was quiet. The fire gave off its low and even heat. He rested his head back against the chair. The pipe had burned down. He noticed it the way he noticed most things in that room at that hour, not with attention, but with the quiet edge of awareness that never quite left him, even in stillness. The drawer had grown thin. The tobacco was spent. He set the pipe on the arm of the chair. It rested there at a slight angle, the bowl cooling already, a last thread of smoke uncurling from it into the air above. The thread rose, bent once in some small current near the ceiling, and was gone. The room was the same as it had been. The fire gave off its low and steady warmth. The rain moved against the glass. The clock marked its place on the mantel without hurry, the way it had all afternoon. He looked at the violin on the settee beside him. It was where he had put it. The scroll toward the window, the varnish holding its dull gleam, easy and without urgency. It had waited there the way objects wait, with no sense of waiting at all. He reached over and lifted it. The wood was cool on his fingers, the neck narrow and familiar in his palm. He settled it under his chin by habit, without thinking about it. The chin rest found its place. His shoulder received the instrument the way a familiar chair receives its occupant. He held it there. He did not reach for the bow. He only held the violin, his left hand loose around the neck, his right hand resting open in his lap. The strings were quiet beneath his fingers. Below, on the street, a cart moved through the rain at a gentle, even pace. The horses' hooves came up soft against the wet stones, a sound like slow breath, steady and without effort. Then the cart rounded the far corner and the sound faded. The room was quiet again. The fire shifted once, a small settling of coals that sent a brief, warm pulse of light across the walls and then drew back. The shadows returned to where they had been. He closed his eyes. The violin rested under his chin. The wood was faintly warm now from his hands. The smell of the tobacco still moved through the room, soft and dark, the way it always did, long after the pipe had been set aside. The fire burned on. The rain continued at the window. And here, if you are still listening, let your own breath settle. Let the room around you grow quiet. The fire is warm. The rain is soft. There is nothing that needs doing now. Only this. Only rest. Let the sound of the rain and the fire carry you the rest of the way. You are easy. You are still. Let sleep come in like the grey light through old glass, without effort, without noise. Just the warmth. And just the quiet, just this. He opened his eyes. The room came back to him as it had been. The fire, the rain, the familiar walls of 221B settled around him in the grey afternoon light. He lifted the violin from beneath his chin. The movement was easy, without hurry, his hand already knowing what to do. The neck passed through his fingers, and he turned the instrument gently, the way a man turns something he has held 1,000 times before. He set it on the settee beside him. The varnish caught the firelight as it came to rest, a soft gleam moving once across the wood and then going still. The strings gave no sound. The instrument lay quiet on the cushion, the scroll toward the window, the same as it had been before he lifted it. His hand remained on it for a moment, just resting there open across the body of the violin. The wood was warm now from his hands, no longer cool the way it had been when he first reached for it. A small thing, noticed without thought, the way you notice the weight of a familiar coat. He drew his hand back into his lap. The fire shifted, low and easy. The rain moved against the glass in its steady, untroubled way. From somewhere below on Baker Street, muffled by distance and the wet November air, came the sound of a door closing softly. Mrs. Hudson, perhaps, returned from some small errand in the cold. The sound was gentle, unremarkable. It asked nothing of him. The room absorbed it and was quiet again. He looked at the violin lying there on the settee. The bow was across the room, resting where it had rested all afternoon. He had not reached for it. He did not reach for it now. The fire burned on. The rain continued. The clock on the mantel kept its place as it had all afternoon without urgency. He leaned back into the chair. The leather received him. The cushion, worn to the shape of long occupation, held him the way it always had. The warmth from the grate moved across the room in a soft, even wave and settled around him. His eyes were heavy. The pipe was cold on the arm of the chair. The violin was still on the settee. The rain was soft. The fire was warm. There was nothing else. Only this room. Only this afternoon, grey and quiet, drawing gently toward its close. The grey light at the window had softened further, the afternoon folding quietly into itself the way November afternoons do, without announcement, without hurry. Outside, the rain continued its steady work on the stones of Baker Street. Inside, the fire breathed on, low and warm, casting its gentle light across the room. The violin rested. The chair held its occupant. The clock kept its patient measure. London moved on beneath the wet grey sky, cab wheels turning through the wet, 1,000 small lives going about their quiet business. And in this room, above the street, the fire burned and the rain fell, as they had been falling all afternoon, keeping their own soft, unhurried time.